curious, I mean, just say, for those of you who are literature majors, this is now getting very meta, because we are now talking about Sarah as a character as well. If Sarah had done this, very, very interesting. Anyway.
No, I don't think that Sarah would have done anything with that information that she didn't do with the other information, which is tell it masterfully in the story. She took, I mean, it's not that it was all just narrative. I mean, she took a lot of documents and facts and things and tried to turn it into, and did turn it into a story. So I think it would have made the podcast definitely, I don't know if it could be any more stronger or compelling. It would have been, but I think if some of these things had been discovered before, like during her investigation, it would have really, it would have been much more strongly in favor of Adnan being innocent, I think. Whereas a lot of people, if all you did was listen to the podcast, a lot of people still might have walked away thinking, I'm not really sure. So unless you were following up on all the other stuff, which for a lot of people is meaningful stuff. So that's the only thing I think it could have led. I think it would have been better for Adnan and his case if that stuff was there. But having said that, it has come out, and I know the Baltimore legal community is paying attention, including the judges, and I'm glad it's there before his hearing in June.
And on this side of the room, you guys have been spectacularly silent.
I saw some hands, Yeah.
I have a question. So thank you, Bruce and Rabia. I was wondering, so Rabia, you spoke earlier about like the failure of this 1.6 billion, group of people, of Muslims, to really connect to the world. And I was wondering, like, how exactly you see Serial as a vehicle to connect to mainstream community, coming from the side of like being Muslim American, and like what other avenues you see of connecting?
Yeah, I think this, for a lot of people who work in, and because I live close to DC, so it's full of Muslim, activists and advocates, and a lot of them doing this kind of work. And I think for them, they see openings in ways they haven't seen before. They see that, first of all, here I am, our very, literally Skyping from home in a headset podcast is how we created Undisclosed, 3 lawyers headset. And I'm narrating it. I'm a woman in hijab, and it's been like #1 on iTunes for 5-6 days. We've hit like 1 million, listens. And that's not something that, if we had tried to craft like strategically, and people have done it. There's lots of podcasts about Muslims, and nobody listens to them, not even Muslims. Nobody just listens to them. Okay? They're there. So the question is, how do we move from that into telling stories that are not about, that are not related to our faith? Like, why can't we do this successfully? Why can't we, have stories of, like, a law enforcement officer who talks about his law enforcement career, talks about something else, or a doctor, somebody or something else that has nothing to do with their faith. And one of my friends, she always gives the example of like Jon Stewart, right? Everybody knows he's Jewish, but his Jewishness is never, like, that's not what people go to him for, to tell us the Jewish story, right? He's funny and relatable. So, and I think what's going to happen is, I went to law school in 97 when, I was like a unicorn. Nobody was brown and Muslim, like an immigrant, and was going to law. If you were not pre-med or medical school, you were like going to become an engineer. And so I was like a total failure, and I went to law school. But what's happening now is, like, my daughter's going to go to college soon, and our kids are now at the point where parents are much more like, listen, yeah, it's okay, you can become journalists, you can become writers, you can become artists. And I think as we start to populate these spaces, it's going to naturally happen.
Yeah, I think that part of this is distinct to the situation of Muslim Americans now at this time. Some of it, though, really parallels very similar experiences that communities have had integrating into the United States over a long period of time. It takes a while. There's the kind of rise of people into professions, there's the rise of people in entertainment and Hollywood, and the kind of normalization of characters in stories, and the kind of and of underlying it, now speaking as a journalist, is this question of visibility and invisibility. It's about whose stories get told and whose stories get untold. I feel journalism now has a far larger number of Muslim American reporters than it did 10 years ago. consequence. I don't know that you can point to some huge ideological change, but the stories that those reporters tell, whether they are domestic stories here, or someone like my friend Rabia Chaudry America tells when she goes off and covers conflict in the Middle East, those are often very different stories than people who aren't coming out of a certain set of experiences would know to cover. There's a great journalist and writer named Gayatri Bahadur, who's a Indian Guyanese American, granddaughter of South Asian immigrants to Guyana, who had herself came to this country as an immigrant. And when she was a reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer, she got the immigration and ethnic communities beat. And then she was sent to Iraq and ended up writing about invisible minorities in Iraq, because she was so accustomed to be an invisible minority in the United States. She ended up writing great stories about Iraqi Roma, great stories about Iraqi Hindus, kinds of subsets of the country, Baha'is, people that you wouldn't know anything about. And now she's done her own book, a great book actually. She's a Yale undergraduate, not law school, called Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture, which is about her own grandmother's experience as an indentured servant coming to Guyana early in the 20th century. And by doing so is elevating, this book elevates this entire subset of immigrants in the Americas whose stories were never in the headlines before, were never news. As journalists emerge from communities and take on advocacy, gradually they do bring with them important changes in the narrative, in the culture. And I think Serial is a great, brilliant, your work on Serial is a brilliant example about that, of just a normal whodunit in a way, a reporting procedural, like a police procedural, that happens to involve a Muslim American, but the fact that it does is of profound historic significance, and itself opens doors. And that's another, again, for those of you who are advocates, whether you're lawyers, one of the lessons of journalism is that we tend to tell stories in the particular, rather than in the generic and abstract. As a journalist, I've never told the story of all African Americans. I can't do that. I can tell the story about one kid from Fairhaven who's African American who was shot by East Haven police in 1995. I can tell you that story. But I can't tell you the bigger story. Historians can do that, others can. And when you're working with journalists, you need to know that. We deal in the particular. And then those particulars become part of the national narrative, become part of the whole.
I was wondering about the changing media. I'm sure you kind of alluded to this, but I mean, one reason why I've read that the New article had this kind of lacking fact checking was because of the changing media pressures, and this was such a salacious story that the editor probably just couldn't let it go, and maybe didn't do as good of a fact checking job as they could have because it was such a great story. And I was wondering for advocates for the journalists, what are the new pressures you face, and the new
Well, the new pressures are podcasting, first of all, and the new pressures are social media, and everything moving so fast that we are constantly racing to keep up and are expected to produce more with less resources. And that creates dangers and openings. The dangers are of catastrophe, like all this stuff. The opening is that actually we need advocates more than ever to help us identify issues and build relationships, because our own time, the time that the journalists that I work with by and large, to spend their own time developing sources in communities, gradually unpeeling the onion, we have less time than we ever had. So to the extent that you can be the express ramp to a great story, reporters are going to love you. I don't actually think that that's what happened at Rolling Stone. If you read the Columbia report, I don't think it's that they were so rushed or so short of resources. They've done other controversial stories, like the story about General McChrystal a year and a half ago, about 2 years ago, got fired. others that got a different kind of fact-checking. I think it's something else, and this is of profound relevance to advocacy as well as journalists. I think that what happened is that the reporter, and by extension all of her editors, got locked into a sort of what I would describe as a very neurotic relationship with a source. And that's not a judgment on Jackie herself, but rather to say that sometimes as a reporter, and this has happened to me, a source pushes your buttons, gets under your skin, short circuits your usual judgment a little bit. You become even more passionate, more mission driven. You want to believe her. And you become, and I'm trying to give the reporters and editors involved here the benefit of the doubt, which I think they deserve. I don't think it was like mercenary, like, fuck, we're gonna lose the story, let's not bother checking. I don't think that's what happened. I think instead, the reporter done a lot of true crime stories before. This one really got to her, she thought it was important, she wanted to believe the source, and her normal judgment was short-circuited. So, and her editors very loyal to her, there was a kind of pass-along of this slightly neurotic relationship, this giving up of power. As reporters and as advocates, engaged with the stories of people who are very wounded, we need to remember the core mission of fairness and the core mission of credibility. And we need to be able at all times to say to our sources, here's what I need to do in order to do my job. And it's really that simple loss of, I don't really believe in objectivity, but that loss of individual authority that happened here in a kind of one-time way. I don't think it teaches us a whole lot about what's wrong with the media in general. I think it was a big, bad mistake in that story. But, I know lawyers, when you guys, as advocates, get involved in the cases of individuals, you do have to remember before you take it to court to check the facts, to make sure it holds up, to do all that. And, or as a friend of mine, I have a friend who's a reporter at the New Orleans Times-Picayune, who's one of the 40% of the Times-Picayune staff who lost their homes in Hurricane Katrina, and his job in the years, a couple of years afterward, was to report on the on FEMA, on the rebuilding of New Orleans. And boy, was he angry a lot about it. And I finally said to him, John, you're so angry. How are you able to do this? And he says, well, you better believe I'm angry. But it's because I know that I also know that I need to bend over backwards extra hard to be accurate and fair. I suspect, without knowing, I haven't talked to the reporter at all, but I suspect that what happened here was a reporter who was not really alert to and aware of her own responses and the ways in which her judgment was being compromised. And that can happen when you become champion, whether as a reporter or as an advocate. Does that sound right?
That sounds right. And I think Sarah, we heard it. We heard her self-awareness.
Yeah.
And people really responded to that.
And that's one of the remarkable things about Serial is it's making this kind of naked exposure of a reporter's struggles.
Yeah.
And it's easy to lose that perspective, and I think that's what happened with Rolling Stone. I think the reporter lost perspective on herself, which led her to lose perspective on her source, which led to whatever.
Thank you again so much for coming. I'm wondering, Rabia, if you can talk a little bit about sort of the choices you made in your career. I've been really fascinated to hear that you went from being an activist, deciding to go to law school, and then shifting now into a lot of this media stuff. And it sounds like also throughout your career you've been very connected to the community that you came from, both the broader Muslim American community and like your family friend Adnan. And I'd love to hear about why you made the choices in your career when you did, and sort of how that relates to your community and connection to your community.
Some of the choices were not choices, they were lack of choices, to be honest. So law school happened when, in the end of my third year of, as a pre-med, I was like, wow, I don't know chemistry, I can't do this. I'm gonna fail the MCATs. And I thought, what should I do? Yeah, I'm gonna fail the MCATs, but it's all chem. So I just, without telling my parents, I said, I'm just gonna take the LSAT and see how I do. And I had never, ever, actually I wanted to be a journalist. And
Well, you are.
well,
Now you are.
well, my parents would have killed me back when I was 18 if I had said that. Like, what are you talking about? We don't do that. So I took the LSAT and I scored like in the 98th percentile. I was like, I think this is meant for me. So I did really well, and that was just per chance. And at the time, I was, previously married. I was in not a good marriage. It was an abusive marriage. I was living with like 10 in-laws, an entire, multi-generational family system from Pakistan had just picked itself up, and I had landed in it in Virginia. Had a young daughter. So I was never able to I'm lucky I got through law school. I'm lucky I got a license type of thing. I was dealing with a lot of things. And immigration, I started working in immigration, and then civil rights also happened inadvertently, but I started working in immigration because I was offered 2 internships only my first summer after my first or second summer after law school. One was the DA's office the public defender's office in DC, which would have been great. And one was the law firm, and immigration law firm. And I took that one because I had a small child. And I said, I can't do the public defender's office, like this is with my family responsibilities. So I got into that, and then 4 or 5 years down the road, I was always involved. Like I always had like an activism bug, just because I was raised like that. I always did like interfaith work and all these outreach types of things. And 4 or 5 years into that, a bunch of clients, and actually I lived here in Connecticut at the time. I lived in Connecticut for 6.5 years. In Connecticut, and if the FBI is here, I know what you're up to, folks. For about a year and a half, it was like a pattern of immigrant clients who kept coming in saying, we are being visited by the FBI, by JTTF, which are Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and we're being asked to become informants on a local mosque. Or we're going to get deported, or we're getting leaned on. And I didn't know how to handle this. So I started reaching out to folks working in civil rights, and I eventually had to represent a bunch of clients on these issues. I got involved with the ACLU. I was on the board here in Connecticut. So it's kind of like these things happen inadvertently. And then I've been working with outreach with Muslim community law enforcement. When all the training stuff happened and my client FBI stuff happened, I realized something is really wrong with law enforcement, especially at the federal level. And then I started moving into I started examining what's happening on a policy level. And then when I knew I was going to move to DC, I said, okay, how can I shift all of these different experiences I've had from the grassroots community to my practice to this law enforcement stuff, and make a change that is better for not just our community but for our country. And so I started getting into national security policy in the field I work in now, which is CVE, countering violent extremism. And so it's been, I never expected to be podcasting, I guess is the thing. I mean, when Serial ended, a friend of mine came to me and he said, oh, you totally have to pick up, you got to start your own podcast now so you can highlight everything these other investigators. And I said, no, I'm like, it's not even, I don't have the time, energy, realm of imagination, I think. But then after, it was because I was doing these talks. And I would always ask how many people have listened to Serial, it's like everybody, how many have read the blogs and stuff afterwards? Like almost nobody, like 3 people in the room. And I was like, nobody knows this information that we found. So that's when I realized that, we have to package this better. And we will package it even better next time, hopefully. At first, we got burned pretty bad by the critics, but the popular response was good. So that's kind of been a recap quickly.
Maybe one more?
All right, we'll do both.
What are you two?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I had 2 questions. But they're both similar. I mean, listening to you talk about the woman from Columbia, I work in psychiatry, and so my thought was, boy, that woman needed a therapist. How do you develop boundaries and be able to to understand what is your reaction to your clients or your whoever you're defending, whether they're guilty or innocent? Because I think that would be a really complicated process to be able to understand how to be both an advocate and be impartial. Question 1. Question 2, I thought it was really interesting looking at the popularity of Serial, and then almost as soon as Serial ended was the Jinx with Robert Durst. And looking at both the 1% and the 99%, and looking at that long-form journalism. And everybody talks about the death of long-form journalism and how nobody's interested in it anymore. And I'm pretty sure that this is a perfect example of the fact that more people want that now. But what I thought was interesting about that in comparison to this is that there was some questionable timelines, and how that was presented was very interesting. I enjoyed both how the process, again, looking at how he struggles with dealing with all of that information, and then both of them them sort of coming on the heels then of the ending of both series with the heels of an open investigation at the end. So, but learning how you sort of take care of yourself, I think is like, would be
I
interesting
mean, I
to hear
think
about.
that's a better question for, I mean, for me vis-a-vis Adnan, and this is like a personal relationship.
Yeah.
So, you know, consider any personal relationship that you have, like that's very close, like a sibling type relationship, and, you know, trust comes first. So I trust him and I believe him, and I also have never seen evidence not to trust him. So that's kept me here. I mean, for clients, it's, you know, as long as I feel like I did my best, that's like my measure. If I ever feel like I could have done better, then that's what kind of eats away at me. If I've done my best, then, and I'm also, I mean, I'm a religious person. I'm like, do my best, the rest is with God. That's the best I can do. But you know, immigration can be a pretty emotional practice, and civil rights obviously is very emotional. But I think my clients know when you have done your best. They know because sometimes you'll be crying with them. I mean, like it happens, and that's, I guess, the way I've managed my relationships.
Yeah. On the sort of journalism side of things, actually, a big chunk of the work of the Art Center for Journalism and Trauma is getting journalists to do better self-care and getting news organizations to take seriously their duty of care to journalists. And in particular, and this is really, really important for those who will do human rights work or advocacy work of any kind, whether it's in journalism or law or anything else. A constant engagement with stories of injustice and violence and trauma, on the one hand, is profoundly rewarding as a life mission, and on the other hand, can get under your skin and can be very disruptive. And there's a lot that you can do to kind of keep your balance. Some of which involves going to psychiatrists when you really need to, but most of which is about much more basic sort of psychological self-care. And if you're interested in it, there's actually a lot of stuff on the Art Center website about that. I think it's very important. I deal with this with journalists when I tell them, look, this is not about are you taking care of yourself for sentimental reasons. It's about your responsibility to the job. If you are not sleeping, if you're walking around as a PTSD head case, if you are no longer able to concentrate, or if you're making bad judgment calls about sources, this is not just about the quality of your personal life. This is about your ability to carry out your mission. It's going to undermine your judgment. It's going to undermine your reporting. It's going to affect your ability to get stuff done. So if you believe in your story, if you believe in your source, if you believe in your mission, self-care is really important. And I think that Sarah Koenig's self-care was really, well, I don't know her, so I don't know what she does when she's not on mic. But at least her willingness to kind of reflect on the story's impact on herself and her own judgment was, I thought, a very helpful thing for people to hear, and helpful for other journalists to hear, frankly. So, last question, since we promised.
I was wondering how you bridge the gap or the distance that can sometimes occur between advocacy and entertainment. Because there were times when I was listening to it when I suddenly realized this is a real story. And even Sarah at one point in the podcast said, you know, when the phone cuts off because he's out of time, making a call from prison, she said, oh, I forgot where he was. And I sometimes wondered, if I'm receiving this just as a great story, how much is it mine to hear? And how will you kind of deal with that issue?
I mean, the entertainment had a utility, you know. If it wasn't actually entertaining, I don't think, it has to exist. It has to exist, but to what level it exists depends on the people listening, I guess, the person listening, and to what level they can empathize if this is a real story. And I think overwhelmingly people listen to it and say, now I'm ready for I'm ready for season 2. I mean, you heard that a lot. I saw that a lot online. And so my response to that was like, no, the story's not over. The story's not over. He's still there, and we're still here. And that's why I've been like, I'm trying to be as relentless as possible until I see cracks happening on a legal level. Having said that, I would never, you take the good with the bad, I would never have, I mean, we needed that entertainment value to bring us to where we were. And I think it's exploitive and damaging when it happens for the sake of that and then people just move on. I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
And even for something like Sarah, you know, it was right before the last episode aired, I saw her, she came and she had some follow-up questions for me, and I said, listen, when episode 12 aired, like, are you done? And she's like, no, I'm not done with it, no. I'm gonna continue to be connected. And I think that's because she has a lot of integrity, and she's very invested in, like, you know, him as a human being and not being exploited. So, you know, the entertainment, we needed it.
I think we have a responsibility, journalists have a responsibility to be entertaining, we have a responsibility to be seductive, we have a responsibility to create products that stories that people want to read, or want to listen to, or want to look at as photographs. We're betraying the story if we turn it into a pile of facts like a phone book, or if we make it eat your peas, you know. At the same time, I do think personally, I believe in a kind of engaged journalism. I do believe there's a way of framing stories that leaves people not just aesthetically satisfied by the story, but leaves them curious, leaves them engaged, leaves them wanting to do something about an issue. And I think that's part of the craft too, is to combine entertainment, to use your word, to combine the narrative craft with enough of a sense of kind of disruption, of leaving good journalism on a subject like Syria leaves the viewer, reader, listener, downloader someplace different than they started out. Different narratively, but also different intellectually, politically, whatever. And I think you listen to Serial and you're changed by it, by following this meandering, strange story from beginning to end. You're changed in complicated ways. And I think that's what we look for. Thank you all for hanging out.
Thank you all for coming out. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Undergraduate Prison Project, the FM House, and who else? Oh, South Asian Society. And finally, thank you to Rabia and Bruce for coming. I don't know if you guys are hanging around.
I can't do it.
5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Let's give it one more round of applause.
This is when you start networking.
Oh, you're Margaret too.
Yeah, I know Margaret's doing that.
I'm so glad we have no she's coming.
Yeah.
How have you been, man? How is camera work? Can I put you on the board? Yeah, I'm gonna put it on the board. It's your picture.